Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning, everyone. I'm Fariza from Faculty of Education, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. I do hope that everybody is in a very good condition today, okay? And before I proceed, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the organizer for this invitation. And inshallah for this keynote session, I'll be talking about advancing a new path for lifelong learning via open and distance learning and how do we get there. So let's get started. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good morning once again. Alright, so through this topic, inshallah, I'll be talking about lifelong learning and open and distance learning, and then maybe a bit on the definition of ODL, and then the domains, or what are the elements that needs to be there for us as a higher education provider to implement a good open and distance learning. And then I think I will also talk about some of the theories or learning theories that can be used in open and distance learning classes, and in order for us to help students to become more motivated and then to help them to become more effective learners. All right. So before we go further, let's look at the definition of ODL and what it's meant by ODL. What is actually the original philosophy under this program or open and distance learning program. So if you look at the definition given by COL 1999, ODL is actually associated with the condition where learners and teachers or students and lecturers are separated in time and place, which means that when we talk about distance learning, students and lecturers are not in the same place or in the campus, right? Students might come from different parts of the country or different parts of the world, but learning and teaching and learning will still take place, right? So that is one of the main important characteristics of open and distance learning. And then it's also about accreditation, and of course in Malaysia we have ODL programs where it comes with own code of practice of COPA. Even though some of the programs might be based on the conventional program that has been done or that has been offered all this while by the institution, but when it comes to the implementation or when we want to start offering ODL, what needs to be done is actually to come up with a new COPA document. All right, so because it should be accredited. Therefore, ODL program in Malaysia context of higher education needs to be done that way. And of course, if you look at this definition, ODL also relates to the use of media, but maybe because this definition is written in 1999, so we can still see the word courseware there, But since we are now in 2021, where we have enjoyed lots of or abundance of advanced technology that can be used or can be fully manipulated to enhance teaching and learning, so we can get use of that, right? And we can also have all sorts of learning materials, not only in the form of textual materials, but we can always embed videos or other multimedia integration into our teaching and learning materials. And of course, in this definition, we can also see that the emphasis is given on the communication. It should be a two-way communication. It is not one-way communication. That's why it is important in ODL. We need to ensure that the sense of presence among lecturers needs to be there. So students need to have a fully support from lecturers and as well as the perhaps online facilitators to make sure that all the interaction will take place effectively, right? But having said all this, it doesn't mean that ODL needs to be conducted fully online, because ODL has been there for years and perhaps centuries. In other countries like underdeveloped countries like in Africa, for example, there are lots of ODL programs that have been implemented not via online or that requires internet connectivity, because we know that in some of the countries over there, there are lots of issues with internet connectivity. So ODL in other parts of the world might be implemented via face-to-face, or physical, still have a physical contact between learners and students. But of course, when we have opportunity to use any platforms or any online applications which is available now, there is also possibility to conduct ODL using a hybrid or blended learning, or maybe we can also at the same time conduct ODL using a fully online format, right? ODL also presents a potpourri of benefits, where it transforms education to become more flexible and more accessible, so as to meet the needs of the 21st century learners. So this is very much related to the progression and advancement of technology that we have now. And then at the same time, we in higher education, of course, we talk a lot about instilling 21st century learning skills among our students, right? So I think using or preparing ODL programs by looking at all these aspects, the learning approach, teaching approach, assessment approaches, as well as the kinds of learning materials that is possible for us to provide to our students, will help them to gain more skills which is related to 21st century learning skills as well. So if you look at UNESCO's definition, open and distance learning actually represents the approaches that focus on opening access to education and training provision, and it also freeing learners from the constraints of time and place, and at the same time offering flexible learning opportunities to individual and groups of learners. So from this definition again, we could see that in ODL, it is there are few elements that are emphasized. For example, we already talked about the flexibility of learning, the accessibility for learners to get an access to all the learning materials and learning activities regardless of where they are, anytime, anywhere, right? So this is actually the gist of open and distance learning concept, right? So all in all, it can be concluded that for open and distance learning, there are at least three kinds of characteristics. The first one is flexibility, the other one is accessibility, and the third one is multiple modes that where we can use various kinds of delivery system and then learning resources to help our students to become more effective learners. Right. So why ODL? Why ODL at the first place? Because the philosophy behind open and distance learning as compared to more conventional programs, is because ODL, most of the time ODL programs cater the students who are employed, or in other words, we cater for working adults, meaning that they are working and at the same time they want to pursue their studies. Right, so now let's look at the domains or the elements that we need to have before we are able or we are ready to provide or implement ODL program. As you can see here, there are at least 7 elements, which is curriculum design, learning materials, teaching and learning, facilities and infrastructure, assessment system, learner support services, as well as program monitoring or evaluation. So let's dive into them one by one. In terms of curriculum design, of course, it is undeniable that the first thing or the most important element that we need to start with is actually by looking at the curriculum design. In order for us to start offering any ODL programs, we need to have a curriculum. Your ODL program might be based on the current conventional program that has been offered all this while. you can also actually come up with a brand new programs. Yeah, but in the case of using the conventional program, and then we want to turn it into ODL program, what we have to do in this phase is actually to create, and then we might want to revise a bit and adopt the content standards and all the learning objectives. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, that it is emphasized by MQA that when we talk about ODL, it is important for us to make sure that the acquisition of 21st century learning skills can be obtained by our students via ODL program, right? So if we have one or two conventional program that we want to convert into ODL program, then therefore the modification should take place in this phase, which is curriculum design. And then, of course, as usual, the intended outcomes should be achieved by the end of the program. I think this is just more or less the same with the conventional program. And of course, in this phase, program providers or faculty members who are engaged with this program or ODL program needs to think about the most appropriate instructional approaches. What kind of instructional approaches that we want to embed or we want to integrate whenever we conduct our ODL program. And of course, when we talk about CLO or course learning outcome, at the end of the day, students will be assessed, right? So, and of course, the assessment aspect is actually crucial as well. That needs to be also planned in this phase, right? So, and it is also important to note here that based on our observation and based on our experience in developing ODL program, and while reading lots of literature review, we found that it is also vital for ODL program provider to put into consideration in terms of the learning outcome, what we want our students or our learners to achieve at the end of the day. And of course, it is not merely on content driven, but rather in ODL program, because it is related to lifelong learning. We are catering to working adults, those who are working industry. Therefore, the best or one of the most recommended kinds of curriculum design is should be based on competency based. We want to enhance our learners competency, and we want to enhance their skills and not only their knowledge, but it is also important for us to ensure that students or learners who come for our ODL program will be able to develop their competency, and not only in terms of the the definition or the content or the concept, but rather it should be translated into more accessible behaviors or more accessible projects that reflects their competency, right? And of course, in terms of curriculum design, don't forget about the aspects of pedagogy or andragogy or heterogogy and cybergogy and whatever goji that we have. Okay, so think about the suitability of these approaches, and then suit it with your group of students or your target audience. And of course, remember that ODLs is also about flexibility. So think about how can you make the learning flexible to them. Yeah. All right. So this is the first phase of elements that we need to have before we are able to come up with a ODL program, right? And in terms of learning materials, we need to be careful because in ODL, it relates very much to the self-directed learning. In other words, in ODL, students should be able to learn by themselves. They need to explore the learning materials themselves and then construct their own understanding. So of course, it is important in this phase for all ODL program providers to have a well-developed learning material. So in ODL, we also have what we call as a self-instructional material, SIM, that can support self-exploratory learning, right? And then it is also important to make sure that whatever learning materials that we are giving to our students or our learners, it should be easily accessible. Yeah, easy to be downloaded, not too big in terms of size. Yeah, or if you are giving, or if you are providing audio format of learning materials, make sure that the audio is clear. You know, the articulation is clear as well, and then the usage of the language is understandable or comprehensible by our learners. And then, of course, it is also important to make sure that we can also provide the learning materials that can engage our students. How can we make sure that the learning materials is engageable? One of the ways is that whenever you put your learning materials in your LMS or learning management systems, what you can do is actually make sure that after students go through any materials, for example, you have 3 pages of comprehension, for example, or articles. So what you can do to engage your students with the learning materials is that you can actually give some follow-up activities. Yeah, for example, after reading this article, share 3 main takeaways that you get from your reading, things like that. So in that way, students know what they have to search for whenever they do the reading. Yeah, so that is one of the ways on how we can actually plan for learning materials. That's why in ODL, whenever you want to come up with a SIM or module writing, it is advisable for all the SMEs or subject matter experts to plan it very well. If you have this kind of learning materials, what kind of follow-up activities that you may want to put after that. So in that way, you will help students to get more focused whenever they do the reading, and at the same time, you will be able to engage your students in the learning activities better. And then, of course, make sure to think about what kind of learning materials that can promote student and content interaction. Yeah, because in interaction we have a student-student interaction, we have student-lecturer interaction, we also have student content interaction. So think about what way can you then enhance this kind of interaction, which is between student and content. And of course, put into consideration the fact that the learning materials should meet the needs of each learner. We know that they are distributed, they are everywhere, yeah, and sometimes they don't have the luxury of time on their side. Yeah, especially when we talk about having students from working adults, they have their own families, they have their own work that they need to take care of, and at the same time they also have to juggle their time, to do the learning activities as well in our LMS. So that is for learning materials. Let's move on to the third one, which is related to teaching and learning. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, that in ODL, there are options whether you want to conduct it fully online, or maybe you want to make it a hybrid format of interaction, which means that you have perhaps some percentage of the students' learning time to be conducted via face-to-face, or some other allocation of percentage of student learning time to be conducted via online, right? And then, of course, make sure that when we conduct teaching and learning, so when we plan for teaching and learning in ODL, it should always be learner-centered. Or in other words, we need to promote self-directed learning, not teacher-centered learning or lecturer-centered, right? And of course, whenever we have online meeting with our students, try to plan activities that promotes active learning. try to plan activities that will make them engaged with the learning experience, right? And of course, when we talk about online learning platform or learning management system, make sure that there are functions where students can always put their questions or ask questions in the discussion forums, or sometimes we may make it as a compulsory activity. For example, for topic number 7, so we ask our students to make sure that they participate in the online discussion. So otherwise they won't get any marks, for example. So we can always give motivation for our students by giving some bonus marks, for example, so that they will be trained, their behavior will be trained to get used to putting or getting information as well as contributing to the online discussion in our learning management system. And again, flexible learning and digital pedagogies, again, it appears here. And then you may also provide space for students to write their own self-reflection. So this is very much interesting to see or to learn that whenever students are given opportunity to write self-reflection, they will be able to express themselves. So from their expression and from their writing, we can also learn something about what has been learned and what kinds of learning experience that these students had undergone. So in that way, we actually, as lecturers or as the program provider, we can also learn about how to improve, how to improve and how to plan for the next batch of students in the next semester, for example, right? So, and of course, remember that in ODL or in distance learning, we need to also make sure that active interaction takes place between students and lecturers, because active interaction will promote the learning pleasure, and at the same time, when students experience learning pleasure, they will be more motivated. And when students are motivated, they will be more engaged, and then they will produce more or better performance. Now, in terms of facilities and infrastructure, whether we like it or not, whenever we want to provide ODL program, these are the things that we need to provide to our students as our customers, right? So I've divided this into 3 phases in terms of facilities or support for students. We have information phase here, we also have learning phase there, and then the result phase at the end. So when we talk about information phase, we need to provide our students with details on course information, process, registration process, learning modules, help desk support, as well as orientation module. And in terms of learning phase, make sure that whenever we provide ODL programs, it needs to be sufficient in terms of self-instructional material. Sufficient in the sense that student might not need to get or look for extra reading. Sufficient in the sense that student, whenever they read up the module, they will gain or they will obtain enough knowledge which is expected from our course. In terms of learning phase, it is also important, as we mentioned earlier, that students need a sufficient self-instructional material. And then for those who plan to provide students with modules, with reading modules, make sure that the modules is sufficient enough. Sufficient is in the sense that whenever students read the module and then the acquisition of knowledge is sufficient for us to assess it through our course, right? And then students may not have to look for extra reading materials out there. So make sure that everything is in your module, all the reflections, all the follow-up activities, and as well as the exercises, questions, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so in terms of learning activities, of course, students needs to be given opportunities to actively take part in their learning activities. Yeah, so think about what kind of activities you may want to give to your students, because in ODL we might not have face-to-face or online a synchronous meeting with our students as much as we have when we have conventional we conduct conventional program. Yeah, in ODL we might have lesser numbers of synchronous meeting with our students. So use that session, which is synchronous session, to come up with learning activities that will engage our students actively, right? And then in terms of self-monitoring system, it is also advisable for all ODL providers, program providers, to set up their LMS to make sure that whenever students log into their LMS, and then whenever they go through all the topics and then take part into in the discussion and whatnot, so there will be a progress bar counted. Yeah, so it is important to not only to motivate students and to show them that, hey, you have done this far, right, for example, but it's also important for us as SME or for lecturers to monitor their progress as well. And then sometimes you also need to think about how you can give electronic feedback or automatic feedback for our students, and then make sure that for online facilitators to also reply to any questions, or perhaps give some feedbacks to whatever students posted in the online forum or discussion. And then of course it is also important that during the learning phase, lecturer's sense of presence is very much appreciated by the students. Right, so let's look at the assessment system phase. Assessment might not be in the form of summative, because we have lots of kinds of assessment that are available. For example, we look at there, we have formative assessment, we have summative, we can also opt for alternative or continuous assessment. And then down here are some of the examples of assessment that we can provide to our students in ODL program. Yeah, we can also use peer assessment so as to make sure that students are engaged, and then to maybe increase the interaction between students and students. Yeah? So whenever their friends are giving comments or constructive feedbacks for their works, then therefore we hope that this will get them to know each other better, and at the same time to be more active, and then be more confident to express whatever they think of. Okay, and then we also have task-based. You may want to ask your students to come up with a self-reflection, or perhaps at the end you also want to ask your students to come up with an e-portfolio. But all in all, think about what are the appropriate methods for students assessment, and this needs to be done by aligning it back to what are your CLOs are. So this is what we call as a constructive alignment, right? And the last one, we have a program monitoring or evaluation. So whenever you plan any ODL program and then you implement it, you also have to have a phase where we can monitor, or where we can evaluate or do assessment to all the plannings or all the implementation that has been done during all the previous phases, right? So in program monitoring, it may involve assessment on the ODS system or the structure itself, or you may want to come up with an assessment to look at the effectiveness of your SIM materials. To what extent does your SIM help the students to acquire certain knowledge or skills as expected, for example. You may also want to revisit the delivery system and then the communication system that you planned earlier. And then of course you can also get feedback from students in relation to their values, or in relation to their views on student support service that we have given them. And then look at also the assessment system. Yeah, for this is very important to note that sometimes when we do online assessment, there are many issues that may arise from that process. So by having this kind of evaluation phase, then we can actually from time to time provide better assessment systems to our students. And of course we can also revisit our learning strategies. Is it suitable for our students, or what else can we do for the next batch of students? Things like that, right? And look for curriculum components, and then student progress performance, and also employability. So far we have talked about ODL and its definition, the philosophy behind ODL. We also discussed on the domains or the elements that needs to be there before we are able to offer ODL programs, and then the sub-elements that is related in each phase. So now let's look at some of the theories that we may want to refer to whenever we want to create or whenever we want to produce a pleasurable learning experience for our students. Have you heard about a theory of interaction and communication by Holmberg? This is quite an established theory as well in interaction and communication. So in this theory, there are a few assumptions about interaction and communication, especially when we talk about distance learning, or online learning, where students are scattered all over the country, and then they don't have a chance to meet up with their lecturers. So the first assumption in this series is that the core of teaching is the interaction between student and teacher. This is quite interesting, right? Although we have, in any courses, we do have content, we do have course learning objectives. But based on this theory, the core of teaching is actually the interaction between student and teacher, which means that the emphasis is given on interaction. Right? So how do we interact with our students in online learning? Okay, and then for the second assumption, emotional involvement in the subject matter and a personal relationship between student and teacher contribute to the learning pleasure. So the keyword here is emotional involvement as well as learning pleasure. So how can we ensure that students are not emotional, or perhaps having a positive emotion in our class? How can we make sure that students are happy and then do not feel burdened whenever they are in our class? So those kind of emotional involvement actually plays a great role, to ensure that students will experience the pleasure of learning. So the third one is about learning pleasure encourages student motivation, right? So from the very beginning, it is emphasized on interaction and then emotional involvement that leads to learning pleasure. And in the third assumption, learning pleasure will encourage student motivation. So you can see the correlation or the interrelationship between all these variables, yeah? So for the fourth assumption, it is said that student participation in decision making concerning their study supports student motivation. What does this mean? It means that in whatever learning activities, we need to give students empowerment. right? Students should be given a power or free will to decide on whatever decision they want to make in order for them to move forward in their learning. For example, you may want to discuss with your students what kind of assignments or what kinds of format of assignments that they want to produce at the end of the day, for example. So and of course, it is about interaction as well. When you give them voice, when you give them opportunity to voice out their thinking, students will be more empowered. They will feel that they are appreciated, their voice are heard. So this will also increase students' motivation. And for the fifth assumption, strong student motivation will aid learning. So can you see the cycle of it? Starts with interaction, and then we have emotional involvement, and then leads to motivation, and then leads to the decision making, and again, strong student motivation will aid students' learning. Okay. The next one is about learning pleasure is supported by a friendly personal tone and easy access to the subject matter. So what does this mean, right? So what we can learn from this assumption or from this theory by Holmberg is that it is also important for us to be friend to our students. I mean, especially when we deal with learning adults, right? They might come from different background. They might have lots of experience prior to coming to our class. So it is not harmful for us to learn from them, ask them to share whatever experience they have out there with their friends, right? So, and of course, when they think that they can actually transfer all the learning skills or all the learning concepts that they gain from the class, and then they try to bring it out to the context of their work, then that will be much easier for them to digest, and then it will be much easier for them to appreciate how practical all these concepts that they have learned in class into their daily work. So the final assumption in this theory is the effectiveness of teaching is demonstrated by students' learning of what has been taught. So when we go back to the interaction and communication aspects, one of the ways to enhance the quality of interaction and communication with our students, we can also give them a session or a time for them to demonstrate or present whatever they have learned to their friends. We can also give them projects and then ask them to explain it to the class. Either you want to make it synchronously or asynchronously, right? So all in all these 7 assumptions in communication and interaction theories is about how much we give our students empowerment through the communication and interaction, and in that way it is hoped that students will be more motivated and then will be more confident in terms of their self-esteem and to voice out whatever they are thinking of, and then and in that way we can actually make sure that students will feel the sense of belonging to their learning. All right. And the second theory that I want to share with you is transactional distance theory by Moore. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this theory, or maybe some of you have used it into your daily practice, but it's alright. Alright, so in transactional distance theory, it is said that the transactional distance may lead to a gap in communication, and therefore leads to misconceptions between the teacher and the students. So when the misconception between the teacher and students happens or occurs, it will then influence the teacher's teaching behaviors and the students' learning behaviors. So can you see the interrelationship with between these elements or factors? Yeah. which means that teachers' teaching behaviors and students' learning behaviors might be affected by the misconception that caused by the transactional distance. So it means that whenever we are distant from each other, whenever we have students from distance, then there is a possibility to for the transactional distance to occur, right? So when this happens, then there will be a gap in communication between us as a lecturer and our students, because we think that they are so far away, and also from the student side they will say that it's quite difficult for us to get reach to our lecturers because they are far away from us. So whenever this gap happens, then of course we tend to have or develop misconceptions or misassumptions. Yeah, we think the way we want to think, and our students have their own assumptions, right? So this is very unhealthy condition in the context of distance learning. So we know that we don't have a chance to meet with them face to face. So therefore, there might be kinds of misconception will occur, right? So let's look at some of the other explanation on this theory. Okay, so this theory assumes that the transactional distance is a pedagogic phenomenon. This is one of the phenomenons in the pedagogical aspects. There is geographical distance causes a gap in the student's understanding and the perception of the teaching, which usually does not occur in classical teaching. Why this happened? Because some of the time students were reluctant to ask questions, even though they do not understand very well of the topics that we gave or we were discussing, right? So in this also there must be a dialogue. Yeah, so in order to overcome this gap or this problem, there must be a dialogue between the lecturer and students. There must be interaction, there must be feedback giving, there must be questions and answers between students and lecturer. And of course, the course must also be structured. Yeah, we need to give them a details on objectives, on the instructional strategies, and what kind of evaluation that we want to give to our students. And in terms of evaluation, talking about evaluation or assessment, make sure that you give them a very specific instruction, okay? And then make sure you also provide them with rubrics that they can refer to, because having a rubric with them will give them a broader and clearer picture of what our expectation would be when we want to give them scores for their task, right? So having this given in a very specific manner will tend to decrease the gap or the misconception based on this theory. And of course, in this theory, there are two main variables that affect the transactional distance. The first one is the dialogue or verbal interaction, and the second one is its adaptation to distance learning. So that means if we understand the philosophy behind ODL, we know our students, we know the limitations that they have in terms of not only the space but also time as well. So we need to try as much as we can to decrease, to lessen the gap between us. So we need to understand the needs of our students. We need to dive into their feelings. We need to be empathic to our students, right? And then, of course, open up to interaction. Give them a lot of space to ask questions and give a friendly feedback to our students. And in that way, I can guarantee that students, even though they are far away, that they will not feel any gap or distance at all. So again, I think it goes back to how creative, how passionate we are whenever we want to produce a good learning environments or learning experience to our students. And again, the transaction distance will decrease as the level of dialogue increases. And this will lead to an increase in the effectiveness of learning. So you can see it is like a negative correlation there, right? So when X increases, Y will decrease, right? So or vice versa. So that means if we can lessen the gap between us, learners and lecturers, by giving them more spaces for dialogue, more space for interaction, question and answers, then of course at the same time students will find it to be more conducive. Students will not find that this distance is a hindrance anymore, right? So, and of course at the end what we want to achieve is that to increase or to make sure that the learning to become effective for our students. Now the last part of my presentation is about ODL and lifelong learning. I've been talking about ODL, all the elements or domains, and then I've also presented 2 theories to enhance the interaction and communication in ODL setting so as to ensure that the learning to become more effective. But how then ODL promote or supports lifelong learning? So of course, as we mentioned earlier that originally ODL is meant for outreaching students which is not accessible or maybe because of their locality they have difficulties to come to school or to come to the university or the campus. So in reverse, higher education institution need to outreach for the students, yeah. And then later ODL is also meant for cater for students from adult learners or working adults, right? So, and of course when we talk about working adults and lifelong learning, we know that in lifelong learning it always support the opportunity for individuals to gain access to education whenever they are ready to. Okay, so in this case ODL is actually suitable for students who choose to study through the distance mode because they were employed and at the same time they are not able to quit their job to study full time. So in this case ODL might be the best solution for us to cater for the needs of this group of students or learners. And then of course ODL provided them with an opportunity to pursue their studies at their own pace while keeping the job. So that's why it is important, as we had discussed earlier, that in the curriculum design, in the teaching and learning design, when we implement ODL program, it should be flexible, it should be accessible, and it should be given in multimodality or multi-modes as well. And then distance learning programs offer students the flexibility to pursue the courses while fulfilling other work, family or academic commitments. So again, we cater for this group of people who have their own commitment, but at the same time they want to have more advanced level of education. And then studying through the distance mode helps participants to add value to their skills and broaden their knowledge. Yeah, and of course in ODL, if you can still remember that it is not just merely based on content driven, but it should be competency based driven. Yeah, that's why people or students who entered into ODL, their expectations is not only to increase their knowledge, but they want to see how practical whatever they learn from any course that they have gone through, and then how much practical it is when it comes to the re-implementation when they go back to their workplace, right? And then students will be able to incorporate what they have learned in the workplace, and this help them improve their skills. All right. And in contrast to formal education, open and distance learning is actually flexible, accessible, and involves multi-learners with multi-modes, with multimedia, at multi-levels and for multi-purpose, right? So this is quite an interesting phrase by way. It all relates to multi, and multi. Okay, and ODL opens learning opportunities, can also promote a learning society, and contributes to preparation of a workforce needed to support sustainable economic development. So this is how, the perspectives of how ODL can actually support lifelong learning. So think about our role, our responsibility as higher education providers. How can we then cater to all this group of people who are wanting to have a step higher in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their academic background? Then ODL would be the best answer. Alright, so I think that's all from me. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera.